At exactly 4:03 in the morning, when the street was completely silent and every normal person in the neighborhood was asleep, the sound that ripped me awake wasn't a knock, it wasn't a doorbell, it was a violent kick against my front door, the kind that instantly tells you something is wrong, and before I could even sit up in bed, a second kick landed harder than the first, followed by a high-pitched, furious voice shouting that this was the HOA and that I needed to open the door immediately. And in that moment, half awake and adrenaline flooding in, I knew something had gone very wrong because no lawful authority shows up at 4 in the morning kicking private property, and as I reached for my phone to start recording, the voice outside escalated, screaming about violations, emergency access, and something she repeatedly called a master key, as if that phrase alone granted her unlimited power over my home. And while she ranted, my K9s were already alert, trained protection dogs. That don't bark randomly, don't panic, and don't react unless there is a real threat, and their low, controlled growl echoed through the hallway, signaling that they had identified an intruder situation. And as I approached the door carefully, staying behind the reinforced frame, I asked her through the door to identify herself and state her purpose, and instead of responding calmly, she kicked the door again and yelled that HOA bylaws allowed her access at any time for inspections and emergencies, a statement that was not only false but dangerously ignorant, and that's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a full-blown power trip, because she wasn't asking, she wasn't requesting, she was demanding entry into a private residence in the middle of the night, and as the dogs shifted closer behind me, their posture calm but ready, I warned her to step away from the door and return during normal hours with proper notice, but that only made her angrier, and she began shouting about fines, towing, forced entry, and how residents like me needed to be taught a lesson, and as she continued, it became clear that she genuinely believed the HOA had the same authority as law enforcement, and that belief had pushed her to the point of criminal behavior, because kicking a door at 4 a.m. while demanding entry is not enforcement, it's trespassing and attempted forced entry. And the situation escalated further when she claimed she had a master key that allowed her to enter any home in the community, a claim so outrageous that it immediately raised serious legal and safety concerns, and as she fumbled with something at the door handle, likely trying to intimidate me into opening it, I loudly informed her that the property was under video recording, that trained protection dogs were present, and that any further attempt to force entry would be treated as a threat. And that was the moment the tone outside shifted slightly, not calmer, but more desperate, as if she realized too late that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and yet instead of leaving she doubled down, insisting she was within her rights, that residents had signed away privacy, and that refusal to comply would result in immediate consequences, and listening to her rant, it became painfully obvious that she either had no understanding of the law or believed that fear alone would make me submit. And while she continued yelling, my K9s remained perfectly still behind me, eyes locked on the door, trained not to react unless commanded or provoked, and their presence alone changed the power dynamic, because suddenly her loud threats were met with absolute silence from inside, and that silence made her nervous, and as the minutes dragged on, neighbors' porch lights began flicking on, distant doors opening slightly as people tried to understand what was happening, and still she stood there, an HOA board member at 4 in the morning, screaming about a master key that didn't legally exist, kicking a door she had no right to touch, completely unaware that everything she was doing was being documented and that this moment would soon become the beginning of the worst mistake of her HOA career. The moment she realized the door wasn't opening and that the threats weren't working, her tone shifted from aggressive authority to frantic escalation, because people like this don't back down quietly. They push harder when they sense resistance, and within seconds she was yelling louder, pounding on the door with her fist instead of her foot, shouting that she was calling the police and that I would be arrested for obstruction, which was ironic considering she was the one committing trespass and attempted forced entry, and as I calmly replied through the door that the police were already being contacted and that she needed to step back immediately, my K9s adjusted position behind me, not barking, not lunging, just standing there with focused intensity, which is far more intimidating than noise, and that's when she made her biggest mistake, because she screamed through the door that she didn't care about dogs, that HOA rules superseded pets, and that she had every right to enter, a statement so detached from reality that it revealed just how deeply she believed in her own imagined authority, and moments later I heard her on the phone, loudly telling someone, likely dispatch, that a resident was refusing entry during an HOA emergency, leaving out the small detail that it was 4 a.m. and that she had initiated the confrontation by kicking a door, and while she spoke I continued recording, narrating the time, her statements, and the visible attempts to intimidate, because experience has taught me that people like this rely on chaos and fear, not facts, and the more documentation you have, the faster their narrative collapses, and as she paced on the porch, alternating between yelling into the phone and shouting at the door, neighbors were now clearly awake, lights on across the street, curtains moving, phones coming out, and the situation was no longer private, which visibly unsettled her, because HOA power thrives in isolation, not witnesses, and as she noticed people watching, she tried to regain control by loudly announcing that she was conducting an official inspection. A claim that drew confused looks from nearby homeowners who knew inspections weren't done before sunrise, and when she once again approached the door and rattled the handle, my K9s stepped forward on command, their movement controlled but unmistakable, and through the door I calmly warned her that any further attempt to force entry would be treated as a threat and that she needed to retreat to the public sidewalk immediately, and for the first time since this began, she hesitated. Because confidence fueled by imagined authority evaporates quickly when faced with real consequences, and still, instead of leaving, she began accusing me of intimidation, claiming the dogs were being used as weapons, which was absurd considering they hadn't barked or moved aggressively at all, and as she continued spiraling, I informed her clearly that HOA bylaws do not grant master keys, do not allow forced entry, and do not override state law, and that any such claim would be addressed legally, and that's when the sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Distant at first but unmistakable, and the effect on her was immediate because the moment actual authority entered the equation, her posture changed, shoulders tightening, voice lowering, panic creeping in as she realized this interaction would not be resolved by yelling, and as the police vehicles pulled onto the street, lights flashing softly against the houses, she suddenly began backing away from the door, rehearsing explanations under her breath, attempting to rewrite the last 15 minutes in her head. And when the officers approached, she launched into a breathless story about non-compliance, emergency access, and uncooperative residents, but the officers didn't rush, didn't react emotionally, they asked simple questions, starting with why she was there at 4 a.m, and when she claimed HOA authority, one of them immediately asked if she had a warrant or written authorization, a question she couldn't answer, and as I spoke through the door, explaining calmly that she had kicked it multiple times and demanded entry with a non-existent master key, the officer's expressions shifted from neutral to concerned, and when they asked her directly whether she had kicked the door, she hesitated just long enough to tell the truth without meaning to, admitting she tapped it to get attention, a statement contradicted by the visible scuff marks and the video recording, and as the officers reviewed the footage and surveyed the situation, the reality became unavoidable. This was not an HOA inspection, this was a gross abuse of perceived power, and standing there on the porch, flanked by law enforcement, surrounded by witnesses, and confronted with her own recorded behavior, the HOA Karen finally understood that the authority she believed protected her had vanished, and that this night, which she thought would end with me backing down, was about to redefine her entire standing in the community. The moment the officer asked her to step aside and lower her voice, the entire illusion of authority she had been clinging to collapsed in real time, because people who rely on intimidation instead of legality never know what to do when calm, professional scrutiny replaces fear, and as she tried to explain herself, her story changed 3 times in under a minute, first claiming there was an emergency inspection, then saying a neighbor complained about noise, then finally insisting that HOA bylaws allowed unrestricted access with a master key, a phrase that caused one of the officers to stop her mid-sentence and ask very directly who had issued such a key and where it was documented, and when she couldn't produce anything beyond vague references to board authority, the officer calmly informed her that no HOA has the legal right to force entry into a private residence without consent or a warrant, regardless of bylaws, and that statement alone visibly rattled her, because for the first time someone with actual authority was telling her no, and as the officers asked to see the video footage, I opened the door just enough to hand over my phone while keeping the K9s secured behind me, and when the footage played showing the kicks, the yelling, the demand for entry, and the master key claim, the situation crystallized instantly, because evidence doesn't argue, and the neighbors who had gathered nearby could clearly hear the audio as well, which only deepened the embarrassment and seriousness of her actions, and when the officer asked her again whether she had kicked the door, she tried to backtrack, but the sound was unmistakable, and at that point the officer informed her that her behavior could constitute criminal trespass and attempted forced entry, especially given the hour and the aggressive manner. And the color drained from her face as she realized this was no longer an HOA dispute, this was a legal matter, and while she stammered about intentions and misunderstandings, the officer asked me whether I wanted to pursue charges, a question that shifted the power dynamic completely, because moments earlier she believed she was in control, and now her fate depended on my response, and as I calmly explained that my primary concern was preventing future incidents and ensuring she understood boundaries, the officer nodded, making it clear that restraint was being noted, but that didn't erase the consequences, because the officer then instructed her to leave the property immediately and warned her that any future contact outside normal, lawful channels would result in arrest, and that warning carried weight, because it was no longer theoretical, it was recorded, witnessed, and enforceable, and as she gathered her things and retreated toward the sidewalk, neighbors watched silently, the early morning air heavy with the realization that the HOA wasn't untouchable, and before leaving, she attempted one last weak assertion of authority, muttering that this wasn't over, but the officer shut that down immediately, stating clearly that it was over for tonight and that any further escalation would not end in her favor, and once she left, the officer stayed briefly to ensure everything was secure, asking about the K9s, the property, and whether there had been previous incidents, and as I explained past overreach, it became evident that this wasn't an isolated event, but a pattern of boundary testing that had finally gone too far, and before departing, the officers advised me to file a formal report with the footage attached, noting that the documentation would be important if the HOA attempted retaliation, and when the patrol cars finally pulled away and the street returned to quiet, the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a sharp clarity, because this night had permanently changed the relationship between me and the HOA. And as I secured the door and checked on my K9s, who had remained disciplined and composed throughout the entire incident, it became clear that their presence alone had prevented a much worse outcome, because if that door had opened under intimidation, the situation could have escalated dangerously, and instead, restraint, preparation and documentation had flipped the script entirely, and as the sun began to rise just hours later, illuminating the scuff marks still visible on my door, I realized that what started as a 4 a.m. power trip had ended as a public, documented exposure of HOA overreach, and this was only the beginning, because the consequences of that night were about to ripple far beyond a single porch, a single board member, or a single mistaken belief in a master key that never legally existed. By the time the sun fully rose that morning, the fallout from the 4 a.m. incident had already begun spreading faster than anyone on the HOA board expected. Because when abuse of authority happens in the dark, it feels powerful, but once daylight hits and witnesses start talking, the narrative changes instantly, and by mid-morning my phone was already filled with messages from neighbors asking what had happened, sharing clips they had recorded from their porches, and quietly admitting that they had experienced similar intimidation from the same board member but had never pushed back out of fear of fines or retaliation. And that collective realization alone shifted the balance of power, because fear only works when people believe they are alone. And as I compiled the footage, police report number and timestamps, the legal picture became clearer, not just for me but for the entire community, and by noon a certified letter arrived from the HOA claiming concern about an alleged disturbance involving dogs and requesting an immediate meeting, a tone so carefully sanitized that it was obvious they were already trying to distance themselves from the morning's events. And instead of responding emotionally, I forwarded everything to my attorney, because the fastest way to shut down posturing is to remove it from the realm of opinion and place it squarely in the realm of liability. And within hours my attorney confirmed what the officers had already stated on scene, that the HOA had crossed multiple legal lines, including trespass, harassment, and potential attempted forced entry, all aggravated by the hour and the lack of any lawful authorization. And as word of that assessment began circulating quietly through the neighborhood, the board's confidence eroded further, because suddenly their actions weren't just unpopular, they were risky, and risk is something even the most aggressive HOAs fear, especially when insurance carriers, legal counsel and public records become involved. And by the following day, an emergency HOA meeting was announced, framed as a routine discussion but clearly triggered by panic, and when residents attended, the mood was no longer deferential, people weren't whispering anymore. They were asking direct questions, demanding to know whether board members had master keys, whether nighttime inspections were allowed, and whether their own privacy had been compromised, and watching the board struggle to answer without incriminating themselves was revealing, because every vague response only confirmed what residents were beginning to understand, that the board had been operating on intimidation rather than authority. And as pressure mounted, the Karen who had kicked my door didn't attend the meeting, citing stress, a move that only deepened suspicion, because avoidance reads as guilt when evidence exists. And meanwhile, the HOA's attorney issued a carefully worded statement denying any policy of forced entry while also quietly advising the board to cease all direct contact with me, a contradiction that spoke volumes. And as days passed, the K9s became a focal point of whispered discussion, not as a threat, but as a symbol, because people realized that preparedness, not aggression, had prevented escalation, and the narrative that the HOA had pushed for years, that compliance was mandatory and resistance was dangerous, began to crumble, replaced by a growing awareness that the law was not on their side. And when a second letter arrived attempting to impose fines related to obstruction of inspection, my attorney responded decisively, attaching the police report, video evidence, and a formal cease and desist warning, making it explicitly clear that any further attempts at intimidation would trigger a civil suit. And that letter landed hard, because suddenly the board wasn't dealing with a resident they could pressure, they were dealing with documented exposure, legal counsel, and a community that was paying attention. And as the week progressed, the HOA's communication slowed, emails became cautious, language softened, and enforcement notices stopped entirely, because the board understood that every interaction now carried the risk of discovery. And neighbors began approaching me privately, thanking me for standing firm, admitting they had felt powerless for years. And that shift, from isolation to solidarity, was the most dangerous development for the HOA, because once people stop being afraid, authority without law collapses quickly. And as I reviewed everything that had happened in just a few days, it became clear that the 4 a.m. door kick wasn't an isolated incident, it was the breaking point, the moment when unchecked power met preparation, documentation, and consequence. and the HOA was about to learn that this wasn't something they could bury with silence or procedural language, because the community had seen behind the curtain, and they were no longer willing to pretend everything was normal. What the HOA didn't realize was that once fear is broken, intimidation stops working entirely, and their first attempt at retaliation only made things worse, because less than a week after the incident, multiple residents, including myself, received oddly timed violation notices for trivial issues that had gone unmentioned for years, things like trash bin placement, grass height differences measured in fractions of an inch, and vague accusations of non-compliant behavior. And while the board likely believed this would reassert control, it had the opposite effect, because now residents were comparing notices, sharing timelines, and realizing that enforcement was being weaponized. And when people recognize patterns, authority erodes fast, and as screenshots circulated in private group chats, it became obvious that these notices all appeared after the 4 a.m. incident and disproportionately targeted those who had questioned the board, which turned suspicion into certainty, and my attorney immediately advised documenting everything, because selective enforcement is one of the fastest ways an HOA exposes itself legally, and as we prepared responses, another development blindsided the board. Their insurance carrier requested clarification regarding a reported incident involving attempted forced entry by a board member, a request that likely came from the police report itself. And that inquiry alone sent shockwaves through the HOA leadership, because insurance companies don't ask questions casually, they ask them when liability risk appears, and suddenly the board wasn't worried about residents anymore, they were worried about coverage, because if insurance refused to defend or indemnify them, individual board members could become personally exposed, and that fear changed behavior overnight. Emails that once carried threats now carried disclaimers, enforcement language softened dramatically, and internal communication slowed as the board scrambled for legal guidance. And meanwhile the Karen at the center of it all quietly resigned from any enforcement-related role, though not publicly admitting fault, a move that confirmed everything residents already suspected, and as weeks passed, a formal demand letter was issued on my behalf outlining the violations committed, the harassment pattern, and the requirement that the HOA formally acknowledge boundaries, prohibit master key claims, and cease any form of after-hours enforcement. And the response from the HOA's attorney was telling, because instead of denial, it focused on resolution, proposing policy clarifications and training, which is legal language for we know we're exposed. And during this time, residents grew bolder, attending meetings, requesting records, and demanding transparency about keys, access policies, and enforcement procedures. And the board struggled to maintain control because every attempt to deflect only generated more questions, and the once feared HOA meetings began to resemble accountability sessions, where residents openly challenged decisions without fear of fines or retaliation, and the K9s, oddly enough, became a quiet but powerful symbol in the community, not because of aggression, but because they represented preparation and boundaries, reminding people that safety and rights don't come from shouting or titles. They come from knowing where lines are drawn and being ready to enforce them legally, and as internal emails later revealed through records requests, board members privately acknowledged that the 4 a.m. incident had changed the risk profile of the association, a phrase that meant exactly what it sounded like. They knew they had crossed into territory that could not be undone, and from that point forward, every action they took was defensive rather than aggressive, because the fear had shifted, no longer residing with residents, but with those who once believed themselves untouchable, and the retaliation attempt that was supposed to restore order instead accelerated collapse, because power that relies on intimidation cannot survive scrutiny, documentation, and daylight. The true breaking point came when the HOA was forced to publicly address the concept of a master key, because once that phrase entered the community's vocabulary, it couldn't be erased, and residents began asking the most basic and terrifying question. If a board member believed such a key existed, how many others believed the same thing? And under pressure, the HOA issued a formal statement denying the existence of any master key policy while simultaneously announcing a review of access procedures, a contradiction that satisfied no one. And during the next meeting, residents demanded to see written confirmation, inventories, and access logs, and the board, visibly uncomfortable, attempted to move the discussion along, but the crowd wouldn't let them. Because once people realized their privacy may have been compromised, procedural language isn't enough, and as the discussion dragged on, the HOA's attorney intervened, carefully steering conversation away from admissions, which only reinforced the perception that something had gone very wrong. And following that meeting, multiple residents filed independent complaints with local authorities and consumer protection agencies, not coordinated, but inspired by shared experience. And that decentralized response was devastating for the board, because it meant the issue was no longer controllable, and as investigators began requesting records, policies, and communications, the HOA entered survival mode, halting all enforcement activities not strictly required, suspending inspections and canceling fines, and in a move that would have been unthinkable months earlier, the board issued a community-wide apology acknowledging missteps in enforcement approach, carefully avoiding names but clearly referencing the incident. and while the apology lacked accountability, it served as confirmation that the balance of power had permanently shifted, and residents no longer saw the HOA as an untouchable authority, but as an organization bound by the same laws as everyone else. And for me personally, the result was peace, not because the situation had been dramatic, but because boundaries had been restored, and the K9s returned to routine patrol behavior. The cameras remained in place, and the knowledge that documentation and preparation worked became the lasting takeaway. And as weeks turned into months, the HOA settled into a quieter, more cautious existence, stripped of the fear-based enforcement it once relied on. And while tensions didn't disappear overnight, the dynamic had changed irrevocably, because authority without legitimacy cannot survive exposure, and that realization had spread through the community like a slow but permanent awakening. The night that began with a kick at my door ended up redefining the entire community's understanding of power, because once people see authority fail under scrutiny, they never forget it, and long after the legal letters stopped and the meetings quieted down, the ripple effects continued, with residents changing how they interacted with the HOA, asking questions before complying, requesting documentation instead of accepting threats, and realizing that obedience is not the same thing as obligation. And that shift alone permanently altered the culture of the neighborhood, because fear-based systems only function when people don't know their rights. And as new board members were elected in the months that followed, transparency became the selling point, not enforcement, and candidates openly promised no after-hours contact, no intimidation tactics, and no misuse of perceived authority, because the memory of that 4 a.m. incident lingered, and it served as a warning. And from my perspective, the experience reinforced a lesson that goes far beyond HOAs, that preparation is not aggression, documentation is not hostility, and boundaries are not disrespect, and the presence of the K9s, the cameras, and the calm refusal to open the door were not acts of defiance, but acts of safety. And that distinction mattered, because it framed the entire narrative legally and morally. And as the community moved forward, the HOA's role shifted toward administration rather than control. And while conflicts still arose, as they always do in shared spaces, they were handled through notice, conversation, and law, not intimidation in the dark. And the difference was palpable, because peace is not silence enforced by fear, it's stability built on respect, and that stability was hard-won but permanent. What lingered most wasn't the confrontation itself, but the realization of how close it had come to something far worse, because had that door opened under pressure, the outcome could have been dangerous for everyone involved, and that awareness led many residents to re-evaluate their own preparedness, not in terms of confrontation, but in terms of understanding their rights, setting boundaries, and refusing to be intimidated. And quietly, the community became more resilient, neighbors talked more, supported each other, and shared information. And that collective awareness became the HOA's greatest limitation, because organizations that rely on ignorance cannot function in informed environments. And as time passed, the Karen who kicked the door faded into HOA lore, a cautionary tale repeated whenever discussions about enforcement arose, and her actions became shorthand for what not to do. And while she never publicly apologized, the absence of her authority spoke louder than words, and the lesson endured, not just for the board, but for everyone watching. That power claimed without law eventually collapses under its own weight. In the end, the most powerful outcome wasn't punishment or revenge, it was clarity, because once lines were clearly drawn, conflict dissolved, and the HOA learned, publicly and painfully, that intimidation is not governance, and authority does not come from titles, keys, or shouting at 4 a.m, it comes from legitimacy, consent, and law. And for me, the experience ended not with bitterness, but with certainty. Certainty that preparation matters, that calm responses diffuse chaos, and that rights defended respectfully are stronger than threats delivered aggressively. And as life returned to normal, the memory of that night remained as a reminder, not of fear, but of resilience, and the quiet presence of the K9s on duty became what it always should have been, not a symbol of conflict, but a symbol of protection, boundaries, and peace.